Today we're going to learn how to make a line plot or a dot plot. You're going to use those words or those names used interchangeably. They basically mean the same thing. Okay, so you can either call a line plot or a dot plot. Okay, so your learning target for today is I can make a line or dot plot given a data set. All right, we're going to start off with what is a line or dot plot. Okay, a line or dot plot looks something like this. Okay, it uses a number line to show the number of times each value in a data set occurs. Dot plots show the spread, meaning how the information is spread out, and distribution of a data set. Okay, a line or dot plot looks like this. All right, so it's going to have that number line down at the bottom. Those are always going to be equally spaced out, so you'll notice 13.0, 13.1, 13.2, 13.3, 13.4, 13.5. It doesn't skip from 13.0 to 13.2 since we don't have a 13.1. We still have to put that space in there. So it's a number line. It has to be evenly spaced out, not missing any numbers. And then we have those dots representing the data. Okay. So to create a line or dot plot, you must follow these steps. The first thing we're going to have to do is draw a number line. All right, so we're going to go down to an example. Now we're going to start by drawing a number line. Okay. Step number 2. We're going to label the number line with the numbers that are equally spaced. Be sure to start with your least value and end with your greatest value. Okay, so for this example down here, they conducted a science experiment on house mice. The teacher asks you, what is the weight of a mouse? Okay, so we weigh some of those mice and we record their weight in grams in the table. We're going to look for our least amount and our greatest amount. So when I start off right here, I see 18 as my least. So I'm going to make sure there are no numbers that are less than 18. Here I have another 18, but that's still our least. So 18 is going to be our least. So 18, I'm going to use another color just to help you out, is going to be our starting point. Now we have to equally space them up to our greatest value. Well, here I see 28 is my greatest. 28 is still my greatest. 28 is going to be my greatest. So I'm going to count from 18 to 28 equally spaced. So 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, and 28. Okay. So now that we have our number line set up, which was step 2, we are then going to place a dot above the number line for each data value. So what that means, all right, we have a 20, so we're going to place a dot above the 20. And we always want to start our first row of dots around the same line. It's not going to be perfect, but it helps us when we start all the dots around the same line, because then when we see the tallest peaks, it actually reflects the data that has the most. Okay, and I'll kind of show you what that means in a minute. Then we have an 18, and notice how I'm going to place it almost in the same level as that 20. A 28, I'm going to place it almost at that same level as those other ones. I have another 20, so I'm going to stack it on top. I have a 19 on the first level. Another 19, so I want to line that up with my other 2. I have a 20, third 20, 23, 21, 22. Notice how I'm crossing them off as I'm putting them on my graph to make sure that I don't miss any of them. Another 21, 27, 20, 18. Notice how I'm not also just like pointing it with my pencil. That's not going to leave a good dot. Okay, so make sure you're shading in a dot. 21, 20, 21, 19, 27, and 20. I'm going to do that one in a different color so that it stands out. Okay, so now you can kind of see we can kind of see the height of those towers, which tells us which data values we have more of. So we can see that our mode in this data set is 20 because we have the most dots for that. Okay, but let's say I would have started and I had 17 and I started them down here and I didn't space them out evenly. Okay, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 20s. What if I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 17s? You see how this is taller than this, so we would assume that this is the mode. Right, so we want to make sure that we're equally spacing out those dots as we go up as well. All right, if that makes sense. All right, so that's how we make a dot plot. Okay, we're going to back up a little bit because this question also had a part A. So we already answered part B, we made that dot plot, but we want to answer, is this a statistical question? Okay, so let's think back to when we learned about statistical questions. Statistical questions are questions where you're going to get a variety of answers. Okay, a non-statistical question is when your answer is always going to be the same thing. So for example, what temperature does water freeze? Well, that's 32 degrees Fahrenheit, no matter what. That's always the freezing temperature of water. Okay, so that is not a statistical question because that's always going to be your answer. So when we ask, what is the weight of a mouse? Is that a statistical question? I want you to make a guess. Yes or no, write it on your paper. Explain why. All right, and then I'll help you out. So if we're stuck, what is the weight of a mouse? Well, we're going to get different answers for that depending on the mouse. Okay, so yes, it's going to be a statistical question because the answers will vary, meaning that they're going to be different. Okay. All right. That's what a dot plot is. All right. But like we said above, the dot plot shows us the spread and distribution of the data set. So we're going to go into some ways that we can analyze or look at that data. Okay, and we do that through peaks, gaps, and clusters. So a peak on a line or dot plot is where the mode is located. That's important. Let's circle that. It's a data value that occurs the most often. Okay. A gap is exactly like what it sounds. Okay, not the clothing store. It is a gap. It's a space on the line or dot plot where there's no data. Okay, so like up here, we would have a gap right here because there's no data right here. Okay, it's a gap, just an empty space. Okay, a cluster is where most of the data is clustered on the line or dot plot. Okay, let's look at this example below and let's label the peak, gap, and cluster. I want you to try. You can use your notes, you can use those definitions, you can reference back to those words. Okay, but I want you to try to label what is this arrow pointing to, what is this arrow pointing to, and what is this space pointing to. Okay, so label those three words somewhere on these lines: peak, gap, and cluster. If you still need more time, please pause the video and then you can resume it when you are ready. Okay. A peak is what we started off with. That's where the mode is. That's going to be the data value that occurs most often. So that's going to be like a peak of a mountain. It's going to be the highest point. Okay, as long as we equally space out those dots like we did here and like we did on our last example, we're going to be able to tell what that peak is just by looking at it. If not, you can always count the number of dots to figure it out. Okay, but this arrow right here is pointing to the peak because 20 was our mode. If you didn't notice, this is the dot plot from this example up here. Okay. The next one we learned about is a gap. A gap is a space where there's no data. Okay, so either we have this area right here or this area right here. Well, this area right here is empty, so that's going to be our gap. There's no data in between 23 and 27. Last but not least is a cluster. Clusters where most of the data is grouped together. Okay, so we're going to notice that most of the data is right in this area. So that is what we call a cluster. Okay. On your test, you will have to be able to identify peak, gaps, and clusters in a line plot. So just make sure that we understand what those words mean. Okay. Last but not least, guys, this is our last example. All right, I want you to try to pause the video, answer these questions, and then resume it. If you need to watch me do part A, because we did not do an example like that, that's fine. But then after you do that, pause the video and try the peak, gap, and clusters. Okay, and try writing a statistical question on your own, because those are things that you should be able to do. Okay, so if you would like a challenge, please pause the video now. All right, otherwise I will go through part A. So the dot plot shows the times of 6th grade students in a 100-meter race. We want to know how many students ran the race. Well, in order to answer this question, what we're going to do is we're just going to count up how many data values we have, because each of these dots represents a student's time in that race. Okay, so if we just count up the dots, that's going to tell us how many students ran in the race. All right, so we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So 20 students ran in the race. Okay. If you needed help for that, that's totally fine, but now pause the video so you can try B and C on your own. If not, if you already did pause the video, just follow along and we will go through parts B and C. Part B, we want that peak first. All right, so that peak, I'm going to do in blue, is going to be this guy right here, 13.8. That is our peak. Okay, when we're labeling that, we can just draw an arrow and label it with the word. Our gap is going to be where there's no data. All right, there's a very small gap here, but our gap is going to be between 13.0 and 13.2, where there's no data. Last but not least, we have our cluster. Our cluster, I would say, is right about here, because that's where most of our data occurs. Okay, that's where most of our data is grouped up. Okay, it's kind of bunched. All right, so that part is done. Last but not least, it asks us to write a statistical question that you could answer using the line or dot plot above. Okay, so what question was this dot plot answering? Okay, well, it says that it shows the times of 6th grade students in a 100-meter race. So there's many different answers that could be correct for this. The question that I chose to write was, how fast can 6th grade students run 100 meters? Okay, and that would be answered by timing them and seeing what the average is. Okay, so using our dot plot, and this is just an extension because on your big ideas it will ask a question like this, but just an extension. What could we say most 6th grade students run the 100-meter race in? Well, we would look at our cluster. So where is most of our data? We'd look at our peak. What is the most common time students are getting? Okay, so I would say, since 3.8 is in the middle of our cluster, that between like 13.7 and 13.8 seconds is going to be about like the average time. Okay, now that we know how to find mean, we could add up all the values and divide it by 20 because there's 20 students to find the actual average. But if we just wanted to eyeball it, we would look at that cluster and we'd say the average student runs between 13.6 seconds to, I'd say, 13.9, which would be this value right here. So I'd say from here to here. Okay, again, that wasn't asked in question C, but on your big ideas, it might ask you to draw a conclusion from the dot plot, and that's what they're talking about. Okay, at the bottom, I would like you to write your summary. Try to keep it around 3 sentences, just so you could describe how to make a dot plot or steps. You could describe what a peak or gap or cluster is. Those are just some things that you might want to include in your summary.